Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I've been slightly under the weather over the past few days, which is why I am streaming from my bedroom. Thank you to Stephen Meffin for covering for me yesterday very competently. I'm delighted to be joined by Grace Blakeley. Grace, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I've also been a bit under the weather. So yeah, my voice is a bit croaky.
Oh my God, it's going to be a croaky evening for you today. I thought I was going to be able to rely on Grace when I get croaky throw to her. Obviously, we really are struggling. I got my Strepsils here. So we'll hopefully be able to get through it. A massive show tonight in a Novara exclusive. We have the first poll in Corbyn's constituency of Islington North, of course. We'll be looking at discussions around the Greens and the type of seats they are set to take in this election. Is there a new Green dilemma between left-wing voters and sort of disengaged Tories? And an investigation has shone a light on Israel killing a civilian family in Gaza. As you would imagine, the United States are completely ignoring it. See no evil, hear no evil. First, though, big news on Julian Assange. So, after spending 5 years in Britain's most high security jail, much of it under solitary confinement, Julian Assange has been released. WikiLeaks put out this footage of Assange leaving Belmarsh and travelling to Stansted Airport. He then travelled to the Northern Mariana Islands. That's a US outpost in the Pacific Ocean. Now, once there, Assange is expected to plead guilty to one count of espionage in front of a US district court. So he had about 17 counts against him. He's going to admit or plead guilty to one, I should say. The sentence is expected to be 5 years and 2 months, which is exactly the time he spent in Belmarsh, which means that the judge will say, I'm giving you this sentence, but you've already served it. Therefore, you are free. Assange is expected then to return to his home country of Australia. Now, this is all part of a plea bargain, which has been negotiated in secret. So this news came as a massive surprise, pretty much to nearly everyone. Last night. His wife, Stella Assange, though, as you can imagine, was aware of what was going on, as was WikiLeaks director Kristin Hrafnsson. And as Assange's plane was sort of taken off, they released this pre-recorded statement.
It's Wednesday, the 19th of June, and it's exactly 12 years today since Julian went into the embassy of Ecuador, which granted him political asylum. Protection from persecution, from torture, from a life imprisonment. And 12 years on, I'm visiting Julian in a high security prison. But this period of our lives, I'm confident now, has come to an end. And I think that by this time next week, Julian will be free.
I just came out of Belmarsh prison in what I hope is my last visit to see Julian here in this prison where he spent 5 years, 2 months, and 2 weeks. And if you're seeing this, it means he is out.
Things are moving very quickly, and it's very difficult for us to plan or even play out the next few hours and days. But if everything goes well, Julian will be on a plane on the way to freedom.
The cost to Julian, of course, has been to be deprived of freedom for all these years. In the battle for journalistic freedom, freedom to publish, foundation of democracy.
Throughout the years of Julian's imprisonment and persecution, an incredible movement has been formed. A movement of people from all walks of life, from around the world, who support not just Julian and not just us and our family, but what Julian stands for, truth and justice. We still need your help. What starts now with Julian's freedom is a new chapter.
I can say in earnest that without your support, this would have never materialized. This important day of joy, the day of Julian's freedom. So thank you so much.
This new chapter in Julian and our lives, we ask for your support as well. In the coming hours, we intend to start an emergency fund for Julian's health and recovery. I ask if you can, please contribute and help us into this new phase of Julian's freedom.
So as you could see there, that was a statement released or recorded by Julian Assange's wife and a senior colleague about a week ago. So obviously they've known what's been going on for a little while now, but that was only released last night when Julian Assange was released from Belmarsh and put onto a plane to this island in the Pacific. As you'd imagine, Assange's family and colleagues welcoming this development. Perhaps more surprisingly, the American security establishment seem relatively pleased with the outcome as well. So James Clapper, he was Director of National Intelligence in 2010 in the United States, of course. So that's when WikiLeaks' most significant cables were released.
I actually think this came out pretty well. I think critical to this was his plea of one count of espionage. I think the law enforcement community and the intelligence community wouldn't have bought into this without that. But he's served essentially 7 years of incarceration in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Was released from that, and then the Brits arrested him, and he did 62 months in jail, hard time in London. So he's sort of, paid his dues.
So that was sort of a senior US official essentially saying, yeah, I mean, he's done his dues, hasn't he? So it's fine. Now, I remember sort of making a documentary sort of about this a couple of years ago, maybe more than that now. And everyone was sort of saying, what you'd hear from sort of people close to Julian Assange is the process is the punishment, right? Because you'd say, is he ever actually going to send to the United States and say, well, we don't really know. But the reason this is being dragged out for such a long time is because this is a punishment in itself. And basically what you saw there is a US official sort of admit to that. Yeah. I mean, the process has been punishing enough anyway. So, all's well that ends well seemed to be what he was suggesting. Not everyone seems so relaxed about what's gone on over the past 12 years. Barnaby Joyce is a former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia.
You had this Australian citizen in jail in Belmarsh prison, which I believe is the almost high security prison in the United Kingdom. He was in solitary confinement, so 23 hours a day incarcerated, one hour a day still incarcerated, but able to get out of his cell. What exactly had you charged him with?
That's not a question for me, I'm sure. I mean, it's a rhetorical question for the authorities. But the fact remains, he is going to be a convicted criminal. Do you think that should matter? Do you see Julian Assange as a hero yourself?
No, I as a former serving member of the Defence Force, I'm not here to comment on the morality. I don't believe what he did was right. It wasn't moral, but it wasn't illegal. And that is the really big issue. If you want to start sending people off to jail for 175 years for things that you think are wrong but are not actually breaking any law, then we're going to arrive at a very dangerous place in the world. And I think that's a view that others had as well.
For insight on Assange's release, which, as I say, have taken most of us by surprise, I'm joined by Yanis Varoufakis, former Greek finance minister, a personal friend of Assange, who's been campaigning for his freedom for years. Yanis, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. I suppose to begin, as I say, this has been a massive surprise to all of us at Novara Media. To most people in the media, it seems that this has come as a surprise. Have you had an inkling that this has been in the works for a while?
Yes, I have to say I have. The first time. This is actually the third offer from Washington, D.C. to Julian. The first happened when he was still in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2018, and I know that because I was present when it happened. I spent at least 7 hours non-stop discussing with him. It was an offer of a pardon, a full pardon, which would have been a major victory for journalism, not just for Julian, from the Trump administration. But it came with a catch. The catch was that he was asked to reveal the sources of, you will recall, those infamous Hillary Clinton emails, because the Trump administration wanted to clear itself of the accusation that through WikiLeaks they were in cahoots with Moscow. And Julian had the evidence that the emails had not come from Moscow. And had he released that evidence, he would have been pardoned. And, the last 6 years of incarceration would not have taken place. But Julian, being, in other words, absolutely a stickler for journalistic standards and principles, said that he would never reveal his sources, even if his sources agreed to being revealed and exposed. So the result was that he turned down the pardon. The second offer happened 8-9 months ago, very close to what has been negotiated now. It involved him being flown to Virginia, where the original grand jury, the whole plot for essentially throwing him in the Supermax prison forever was baked initially all those years ago under Hillary Clinton, I have to remind our viewers. So the deal was that he would agree to drop his resistance to being extradited. He would be extradited, he would be sentenced to 5 years, and then he would be let free and he would be extradited from the United States back to Australia. And Julian said no. And he said no for two reasons. The first reason was that he was not prepared to allocate his guilt in front of any US judge because he was not guilty of anything. And the second reason, of course, is that he didn't trust the United States to honor a deal. He felt that there's a very strong probability that if he ends up in a Supermax prison, even for 1 hour, he would never get out again. So now there seems to have been an improvement on that deal. He will not have to, as you can hear from the news and read in the newspapers, he will not have to go to continental United States. He will not go into prison. The agreement now is that he will not spend even 1 minute in prison. He will appear in front of a judge together with his lawyer and the prosecutor. He will have, and that is a tragedy for journalism, even though it is a complete vindication of Julian personally and of the whole movement that has been supporting him all those years, especially during the dark ages when he was being accused of sexual assault, falsely accused, and we lost the support of a very large segment of progressives across Europe and especially the United Kingdom. Nevertheless, he will have to stand in front of the judge and allocate his guilt, a guilt that is non-existent. But I think he should do it because I don't want to see my friend and my comrade die in Belmarsh or especially in a Supermax prison. He has humiliated the United States. We heard from James Clapper, a representative of war criminals and warmongers who now seems to be quite satisfied with this guilt admission, which was forced through torture after all those years. That has to be stated. Nevertheless, it is a major defeat for journalism because, Michael, your job is not safe anymore. This is the very first time in the annals of journalism that a journalist has been persecuted and prosecuted in a jurisdiction where he's not a citizen, he's never practiced his journalism, and he is being forced essentially to admit to guilt that is simply made of a pack of lies, and to agree to having been convicted for 5 years of hard time, as James Clapper put it. What next? You may be prosecuted next for something that peeves the American administration. The New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, Le Monde should hang their collective heads in shame for having abandoned Julian after having published all the information as they should have published, that he gave them, that WikiLeaks leaked to them, demonstrating to the whole world and to the news, to the readers of these newspapers, the crimes against humanity perpetrated by our governments in our name. They published that information, and yet, the moment they felt the squeeze from the American military-industrial security complex, they abandoned him. And they played along with his vilification as a rapist, as a Trump supporter, as some of them even, sort of dropped hints that he might be on the ultra-right. So they brought about their own demise. Remember, Dan Ellsberg, our hero from the 1960s and 70s, the wonderful scientist, mathematician, and economist who used to work for the Rand Corporation, for the Pentagon, who exposed the crimes of the American government in Vietnam, the famous, I should say, Pentagon Papers. He was persecuted by the Nixon administration. They tried to convict him, to give him a criminal record. They failed. So the legacy of Dan Ellsberg has been effectively sacrificed by the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and Le Monde by not supporting him when they had to support him to ensure that that conviction, which is a conviction of them, not of Julian, should be prevented from going ahead.
What he's pleading guilty to is a single criminal count of conspiring to obtain and disclose classified US national defense documents. But sort of as you've said, this is very much something that he is pleading guilty to under duress because he's been incarcerated for a very long time. I want to talk about the timing of this. Obviously, there's a presidential election coming up. These espionage charges were sort of put on Assange under the Trump administration. I'm not sure if we've heard from Trump himself, but we have heard from his then vice president, Mike Pence. So he responded fairly angrily to the plea deal. So he said this: Julian Assange endangered the lives of our troops in a time of war and should have been prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The Biden administration's plea deal with Assange is a miscarriage of justice and dishonors the service and sacrifice of the men and women of our armed forces and their families. There should be no plea deals to avoid prison for anyone that endangers the security of our military or the national security of the United States ever. It goes without saying, I don't think many of our audience, Yanis, are going to take Mike Pence's words particularly seriously in terms of their sort of ethical import.
The persecution of Julian Assange has been bipartisan. Let's not simply blame the Republicans for this. It was not only Joe Biden who has been relentlessly pursuing over the last 3 years, Julian. He could have dropped the charges. He could have pardoned him, not even pardoned him, just drop the extradition process in London. But at the very same time, let us not forget who started the whole ball rolling of persecuting and trying to essentially murder. And I use this this word judiciously, the body and the spirit of Julian Assange. It was Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State. There is a video on YouTube. You can find it and show it in your program. Is caught on camera saying, "Why can't we take him out? Isn't there a way of taking him out, even by means of a drone?" That was Hillary Clinton. So this is not, Democrats versus Republicans. It is the national security apparatus, the security military industrial complex, with the complete complicity of the United Kingdom's government, state, and judiciary. And remember, somebody else who has egg on their face today is the United Kingdom. Because remember, they were saying that there's nothing they can do to release Julian from Belmarsh as long as the extradition process is in train. Well, you know what, Michael? It is still in train. Because I have it on good authority that the extradition request by the United States government has not been rescinded. So clearly the United Kingdom, given that they released him today, without having ended first formally the extradition process, were lying through their teeth. And we know that because we know that the UK government has been pushing the Swedes, for instance, to continue his persecution on those phony rape charges. So they all have, whether they were Tories or Labour or Democrats or Republicans, they all played a role in the suppression of the rights to journalism.
So in terms of just to get it clear, in terms of the sort of Democrats, Republicans thing, so the Democrats were sort of instrumental in this case in Sweden, the rape charges, which, it's never sort of gone to trial. It's all been dropped essentially. But it was Donald Trump who sort of said, "I'm going to try you for espionage," wasn't it? And apparently Obama didn't really want to do that. And presumably, if Assange had stayed in Belmarsh a little bit longer, this deal could have broken down under a Trump presidency. So I take what you're saying in terms of sort of the complicity, but presumably he did want to sort of sign this deal, get out before Trump became president, because then the whole process could start again.
I wouldn't put it this way. I don't think so. The process is the same process. It started when he ended up in the Ecuadorian embassy, and this is the reason why he ended up in the Ecuadorian embassy. It was because it was clear to all of us that it had nothing to do with the Swedish case. The Americans' national security system, as Mr. James Clapper put it today so eloquently in your video clip, they were after him. And they were after him under Democratic or Republican administrations. And they were going to get their man, because they were so badly embarrassed by the revelation of crimes against humanity, war crimes, direct war crimes committed in our name by our governments. And they were going to get him. So my explanation of why Biden did what he did now is very, very obvious and clear. Biden is facing Armageddon in November in the elections for one simple reason. Remember, what was the difference between Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 against Trump and Joe Biden's campaign against Trump in 2020? The difference was that the progressive socialist, if you want, wing of the Democratic Party, under Bernie Sanders, under Ocasio-Cortez, under the Squad, those youngsters who were motivated by the Democratic Socialists of America, that organization, that faction, if you want, within the Democratic Party. In 2020, they voted for Biden. In 2016, they had not voted for Clinton. And Biden knows that he won the presidency because of them. Now, because of his explicit complicity in the genocide in Gaza, he's running a very, very serious risk of losing all these youngsters. So this is a relatively costless, from his perspective, move to win back some of them. And I think, rightly, Julian, given that he has been granted the opportunity of not spending 1 hour in prison on United States soil, he grabbed the opportunity. I'm glad he did. This is a very bright ray of light in this darkness that we've been facing for such a long time.
And you've talked about sort of the implications of this case for British justice and how it functions. I wanted to sort of read to you or show to you sort of a couple of responses to today's news from sort of the British political establishment. So William Hague was Foreign Secretary when this whole process started. So he said this today: "This is a man who did leak national security secrets of the free societies he's always taken advantage of, and then was wanted on separate charges in Sweden and then fled into the Ecuadorian embassy, where after a few years they wondered how on earth they were going to get him out. And so he's not somebody you want around. And so I don't see him as any kind of hero. But he's pleading guilty in a plea bargain. He has been years unable or unwilling to exercise his freedom. So let's hope this is an end to this whole miserable saga." So very dismissive there from the former Foreign Secretary. Let's now go to the line from the party who are almost certain to form the next government in a week or so.
Well, for me, he's a person who's been subject to legal proceedings. He is somebody who's had legal representation throughout that. That is how our the legal system should work. And I think it should work for him just as it would work for anybody else. It's, of course, perfectly legitimate for Anthony Albanese, who I've met, to excellent Prime Minister of Australia, to make representations on behalf of a citizen of Australia and ensure that there's appropriate support. But for me, it was always about somebody within our legal system. It was for that system to take its course. And it does seem, as I indicated in my last answer, there is now going to be a plea to a serious offence under the Espionage Act. We should just let that play out now, let that plea take place if that is what happens.
That was Labour's Nick Thomas-Symonds. He's a shadow minister without portfolio. Yanis, could I get you to respond to both of those comments? So one from William Hague and then from Thomas-Symonds there.
So many words by which to declare their cowardice and their complicity in war crimes and the attempt to cover them up. William Hague, once more, proved that this Tory party has been a clear and present danger for British democracy, whereas the gentleman from Labour has proven that Starmer's Labour is simply going to be another version of the same Tory government. They do not deserve to represent the liberal traditions of the United Kingdom. Let me remind the fellow from the Labour Party, to William Hague, there's nothing to say, but to the Labour Party, to Starmer's Labour Party, who have the audacity to speak about legal process. Julian Assange, I happen to be somebody who has visited him in Belmarsh, spent 23 hours every day in solitary confinement. And this is a man who's never been convicted of anything and has only been accused of journalism of the highest standards journalism, not for the Murdoch press, but journalism that has been published in the New York Times, in Le Monde, in The Guardian, and so on. To think that the Labour Party representative has the goal to say that this was the legal process and he had the opportunity to exercise his freedom, as William Hague added so usefully, is just standing truth on its head. Here is a man whose life has been taken away from him, who was tortured because the conditions under which he lived in the Belmarsh prison were just complete torture. Even in the Ecuadorian embassy, the United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights declared that the way in which he was forced to exist in there was a form of formal torture. So torturing a journalist for doing the job that every single journalist should be doing. Once upon a time, I think it was Mike Pence. I'm not sure. It could have been somebody else from the American administration, but I think it was Mike Pence. Accused Julian Assange of running, in WikiLeaks, a hostile intelligence service, non-state intelligence service. Of course, this is what he did, but this is what every media organization should be doing. This is why I appreciate Novara, because this is what you do. You are a non-state intelligence gathering organization for the purposes of exposing the truth. If you are not that, then you have no purpose in existing. So these two gentlemen, William Hague and the guy from Labour whose name I do not even want to know, simply declare their unfitness to govern a United Kingdom which has a long tradition of harboring fugitives from totalitarianism. On this occasion, the British state, the main party and the opposition, even the Labour Party that I used to support, I have to say that, they wouldn't pick up the phone when we called them to seek their support for releasing a man whose only crime was to do the journalist's job.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you so much for joining us and for your time and for your campaigning over the years for Julian Assange. Obviously, great to see him released, even with the caveats you talk about there. This isn't exactly sort of justice being done, but it's much better than the situation a week or so ago.
Of course, and we continue, because there are many other political prisoners. There are many whistleblowers who are perishing in jail. In Australia, David McBride is one of them. In Moscow, under the Putin regime. In the West, in India, under Modi's fascist government. This is not the end of our campaign. This is the end of the beginning of our campaign for political prisoners, for journalists, for people who want to tell us things the way they are.
Jeremy Corbyn's independent campaign to retain his seat in Islington North is one of the most hotly watched contests in this entire general election. And for the first time, we have some polling to show what might happen in the vote next week. Now, this is a constituency poll by Survation shared exclusively with Novara Media. And as you can see, it's close, somewhat worrying. Labour on 43%, Corbyn on 29%, and the Lib Dems on 7%, the Greens on 7%, Reform on 6%, and the Conservatives on 6%. So obviously a two-horse race, as probably everyone already knew. But at the moment, Labour 14 points ahead. There was some sort of cause for hope in the polls for those supporting Jeremy Corbyn. So it showed obviously him trailing in voting attention. It also shows he has a higher favourability than both the Labour Party and the current leader, Keir Starmer, in the seat. So in a hypothetical two-candidate contest between the Labour Party and Corbyn, Corbyn would win 55% of votes to Labour's 45%, excluding undecided voters. In the constituency, Corbyn has a net favourability rating of plus 21. Starmer has only plus 0.3. Grace, clearly the people of Islington North seem to like Jeremy Corbyn, but if the polls remain as they currently are, or if this poll is an accurate sort of portrayal of opinion in Islington North, Labour are set to win this seat.
Yeah, it's really disappointing for all of us who've been campaigning for Jeremy. And it just shows, the number one thing, we still have time. It's so important for any activists anywhere, if they can, to go out and get knocking on doors and help the campaign. Because, that is really the only asset that Jeremy has in the constituency. It's the ability to marshal this huge amount of volunteers who are really passionate about his campaign, who are passionate about him, and the example that he'll be able to set in Parliament, and indeed the message that it would send to Labour if he did win. So yeah, there's obviously a huge amount that campaign is up against as well, not least in the form of the absence of any data. Now, a lot of people watching this will have been canvassing before. You know that when you canvass for the Labour Party, you have data on, the likely inhabitants of a somewhere, a house, flat, whatever, before you knock on the door, and their previous voting habits. So, you can target the places that have voted Labour before, and just, it's often the kind of get the vote out operation. It's kind of, do you still support Labour? If so, please get out and make sure you're voting for all of these reasons. Without that data, it becomes much, much harder. It's a kind of blind exercise. We're going to be knocking on a lot of doors that, are not going to vote for you, potentially not even going to vote, not registered to vote. So it just becomes a lot more challenging. And they just need a lot more kind of feet on the ground, basically. So firstly, if you can, get down to the campaign and help him out. But if this poll does prove to be true, and Jeremy doesn't win that seat, it will be immensely disappointing. There will be a lot of jubilation on the Labour right. That's undoubtedly true. And it just does kind of go to show the issue that, you have in this kind of two-party majoritarian system, which is that most people do just vote for the colour, rather than kind of looking into the candidate. And this particular candidate is someone that, as we've seen, has kind of been supportive of the privatisation of healthcare. And, there's been lots of kind of discussion about his, previous comments that I think a lot of people in Islington North wouldn't approve of. But that's not something that really gets out there to the kinds of voters that are going to swing a contest like this. It's easy for us to look on Twitter and be like, oh yeah, obviously this guy's bad. Obviously, Corbyn is great and is going to do well. But there are so many people, obviously, who vote in elections who are, very weakly politicised, if at all, and are just, basically looking at the news every now and again thinking, oh yeah, Labour's probably going to win. They look like they've got a couple of good policies. I want to get the Tories out. I'm going to vote Labour, rather than thinking about the kind of intricacies of each race. So that is concerning. And yeah, again, get down to Islington if you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an election that's going to be particularly difficult for independents. Obviously, I hope Jeremy Corbyn wins. I'd love Faiz Shaheen to win in Chingford. I would recommend people to go canvass for either or both of them. But there's so much momentum now behind get the Tories out, which I think means lots of people are just sort of thinking, I want to do whatever I think is the safest way to get the Tories out, which most people think is voting Labour. Now, obviously, if you're in Islington North, your vote is not going to affect whether or not the Tories get out, because it's either going to be Jeremy Corbyn or Labour. So people should be able to vote with their hearts. But, it's quite understandably, not everyone follows politics particularly closely. So understandable that someone would go into the polling booth and think, I like Jeremy Corbyn, but we can't take any risks. I've got to vote Labour because I want the Tories out. And I suppose that one of the purposes of canvassing is to sort of say, look, in this seat, that's just really not the case. Labour are going to win a massive majority. And anyway, there's no way in hell that the Conservatives are going to win this seat. So you should be able to vote with your heart. A similar issue, actually, in some of those seats where the Greens are competing. Hind Rajab was a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who tried to flee Gaza City with 6 family members in late January. 2 weeks later, she, along with her family, were found dead in the car they tried to use to escape the IDF. The black Kia was later found parked outside a petrol station. Its windows were blown out and the body of the car was riddled with bullet holes. The IDF has always maintained that there were no forces present in the area at the time, and that's a story that the United States has accepted at face value. But a new investigation by British research group Forensic Architecture, audio investigators Earshot and Al Jazeera has come to a very different conclusion, confirming what was really obvious to most people all along, namely that the Israeli military murdered Hind and her family. To reconstruct what happened to the family on that day in January, the investigation pieced together audio and visual evidence. This is a recording of a call made by Hind's cousin, Mlayan Hamadeh, to the Palestinian Red Crescent. This was soon after the family tried to escape Gaza City.
Hello, مرحبا. أيوة بدخل علينا. إذا بابا جنبي. أنتم متخبيين؟ في السيارة احنا زميلة الدبابة. انتوا جوا السيارة؟ الو؟ الو؟
That was Layan telling the dispatcher the car had been fired on and the tank remained nearby. Only she and Hind had survived the initial attack. But as you could hear, Layan was killed in that second round of gunfire. When the paramedics called back, Hind answered the call.
ايش يا عمري؟ يا حبيبتي يا عمري والله معك، هيني انا مش تاركك، بحكي معاكي، ما بدي اصلا اتركك. ايه؟ ايش؟
So even if you're listening on the podcast, there were subtitles there. I'm sure you could sort of hear just the anguish in the paramedic's voice. That you could hear the little girl begging her to come and get her. Hind, surrounded by the bodies of her killed family members and injured by gunshots, stayed on the phone for 3 hours while the Palestinian Red Crescent frantically tried to coordinate with the IDF to send help. Nisreen Kawas is Director of Mental Health at the Palestinian Red Crescent. She spent some time on those hours on the phone with Hind, trying to keep the young girl calm. She told Al Jazeera's investigation this.
In the middle of the exercise, breathing exercise or imagination exercise, she will say, Nisreen, when are you coming to take me? And this has continued on and off all the time, trying to take her direction out of the car, out of the victims around her, out of her murdered family around her. The smell of the blood, can you imagine with me that a 6-year-old is afraid, is hungry, is thirsty, smells blood around her all the time. Dark is coming on soon, and only the phone is her hope.
Eventually, the IDF gave the Palestinian Red Crescent approval to send an ambulance to Hind. The Israeli military provided a map and prescribing a route for the vehicle with the assurance it would be safe if it stuck to it. So, sort of following that, the Palestinian Red Crescent dispatched 2 paramedics, Yusuf Zaino and Ahmad Al-Madoun, but the ambulance never arrived.
They had to ask her, did you hear a bomb now? Did you hear anything around you? And she said, yes, I heard it. Her yes means our colleagues who went to rescue her had died.
It would be 12 days before the fates of Hind and the ambulance crew were confirmed. All were tragically dead. After Israeli forces left the area, civil defense workers were able to get to the site. The ambulance was completely burned out. Civil defense workers say they recovered only bones, a pelvis, and a skull from the ruin. The Israeli military has continually denied any involvement in the attacks, but forensic architecture and Earshot's investigations tell a different story. So first, investigators had to establish who fired on Hind's car.
Satellite imagery taken that day shows Israeli tanks up the road from where the family car was parked at the gas station. This is at 3:31 p.m., about an hour after Layan's call with Omar.
We can also see the amassing of Israeli tanks in the area, which are positioned at strategic locations, such as the intersections of roads, so that they have lines of sight along the main avenues and streets in the area.
Crucial to the analysis is the short call between Omar and Layan.
We hear a total of 64 gunshots fired in just 6 seconds.
What we heard on the phone call, is there any evidence of any kind of crossfire in the area?
No, what we're hearing are 64 gunshots that are all similar in characteristics, similar in loudness. The gunshots were happening roughly 74 milliseconds apart. This meant that the gun firing these shots was firing around 750 to 900 rounds per minute, which is in excess of what an AK-47 or a Kalashnikov will fire, which are the most common assault rifles attributed to Hamas. This range is consistent with Israeli army weaponry, such as the M4 rifle or the FN Mag machine gun on a Merkava tank. We can derive that for the shortest interval of 24 milliseconds, the shooter had to be 13 meters away from the phone. And with the maximum interval that we hear, which is 40 milliseconds, the shooter has to be 23 meters away from the phone.
It puts us within a kind of ring around the Kia that's between 13 and 23 meters.
So the investigation also was trying to establish whether Israeli soldiers had knowingly fired, not just on civilians, but children. Now, based on the range given by the sound analysis, as well as satellite imagery of the area, the investigators were able to reach this conclusion.
We marked all of the bullet holes that we could see from those images. There are holes which appear to be exit holes, so larger openings that are flared, that we witness more on one side of the car than the other. So this gives us a kind of general direction as to the direction of fire. So there's one very distinct line of bullets that we can see at the back, the rear right-hand side of the car, which is a volley of about 30 or so bullets. You'll remember at the end of Fabio's analysis, we saw this ring. And what we're able to do is to superimpose this ring onto the site of the killing. And so we situate the 3D model of the car inside of the site, and we position it in its resting position outside the gas station. And we're also able to model the Merkava tank, and we're able to direct the weapons on the tank towards the car. And this is important because it allows us to draw a line between the guns on the tank and the entry holes that we see on the Kia. So based on positioning the tank in hundreds of places within that ring of 13 to 23 meters, we find that there's a position immediately to the south of the Kia, which appears to be the most likely position of the shooter for this recording.
So from what you've assessed of the Israeli tank position, at that distance, is it likely the Israeli soldiers would have been able to see who was in the car?
We think that it's very likely that they would have been able to see who was in the car, because we know that these tanks are fitted with optical equipment which allows them to see for many kilometers. So yeah, it seems very likely that whatever was going on in the car 13 meters away would have been easily visible.
The investigators also turned to the fate of the paramedics who went to help Hind.
Footage taken by rescue workers and journalists on February 10th and 11th also showed at least 2 different fragments from 120mm artillery shells, including this one made in the US. Due to the possibility of shelling in the area before and after the attack, it's difficult to confirm if these were from the munitions that hit the ambulance. But it appears to have been hit head-on, burning through the front and middle, and pushing the vehicle back.
So there's a likely scenario that the anti-tank missile went through the front of the ambulance and then exited through the back and then pushed the ambulance backwards, as indicated by the markings that we can see on the road.
So that evidence compiled by forensic architecture and earshot seems incredibly compelling. But the US National Security spokesperson, Matthew Miller, this is what he said when he was asked about those findings.
Investigation revealed that Rajab's car was hit with 355 bullets, and it's not plausible that Israeli tank couldn't see children inside the car. Have you seen the reports, and do you have any updates on the investigation? It's been more than 4 months, and a lot of my colleagues have been asking about
Yeah,
that.
so we have seen the reports, and I will tell you what our latest interaction with the government of Israel is about this. So we went to the government of Israel and pressed them for information, and they told us that there were no IDF tanks operating in the area, no IDF forces operating in the area at the time of that attack, which I believe is something they've also said publicly. After further reporting, we went back to them and pressed them again. And so what they told us is that they went to the UN organizations, they went to the Palestinian Red Crescent, they asked for information, because you've seen all of those organizations quoted in stories. They asked for information that they could use to further an investigation, and no one provided them with any information.
We've asked the Israelis, and the Israelis told us no one provided them with information, and we completely believe the Israelis. So that's that. it's just, especially as, I mean, we've heard so many times how the Israeli government has completely refused to engage with so many UN bodies. This idea that, oh, they want to do an open and honest analysis. They're just, no one's going to provide them with the evidence. Why doesn't the United States try and collect some evidence, right? Or look at the evidence which is out in the open? This idea, we asked the Israelis, they haven't really told us much. That's the end of that. It's, this is a government which is arming the Israelis to the teeth, and they just say, oh yeah, we emailed them. They emailed back saying, yeah, everything seems okay. Answering a second question from the journalist, Miller went on to make an interesting slip.
So who shot the 355 tank bullets?
I'm not able to, look, I'm not on the ground. I can't offer any kind of assessment about this. That's why we've called for the government of Israel to conduct an investigation. I can't speak to what their internal processes look like. All I can tell you is what they've all I can tell you is what they've told us, and what they've said is they went to the UN and the Palestinian Red Crescent and asked them to supply information that would help them. And what they claim is that they were given none.
But it's not concluded yet, the investigation, or is it?
No, I would refer you to the government of Israel for that. I can only tell you what they have told us.
We've called for an independent. I mean, we've called for an investigation from the government of Israel, right? He couldn't say we've called for an independent investigation, because they haven't called for an independent investigation, because they're not interested in independent investigations. All they want to do is say, I don't know, just ask Israel. Why don't you ask Israel? What's the point, by the way, in sort of this, having this State Department official doing this question and answers to journalists who are interested? It's not just, oh, this is a different country. Why are you asking? It's because the Americans are arming them to the teeth, right? And they're saying, what is your ally doing? I don't know. Ask our ally. Right? That's the sort of blasé response that you get from Matthew Miller. Of course, Hind is just one of more than 15,000 children who have been killed in Gaza since October last year. Her family is just one of the many thousands torn apart by the war. Some of their stories are told in the Al Jazeera documentary containing the investigation we've just shown you. It's called The Night Won't End, Biden's War on Gaza. Really recommend checking that out. New research by Save the Children has reached an equally harrowing conclusion when it comes to the treatment of Palestinian children during Israel's assault on the enclave. So they've estimated that over 20,000 children are lost, disappeared, detained, or buried under Gaza's rubble or in mass graves. That number is on top of the 15,000 children who have reported to have been killed. Now, Save the Children go on to say this: it is nearly impossible to collect and verify information under the current conditions in Gaza, but at least 17,000 children are believed to be unaccompanied and separated, and approximately 4,000 children are likely to be missing under the rubble, with an unknown number also in mass graves. Others have been forcibly disappeared, including an unknown number detained and forcibly transferred out of Gaza, their whereabouts unknown to their families, amidst reports of ill treatment and torture. All of this means it's really no wonder that the UN has judged Gaza to be the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Even if you're part of the American government, you just say, oh, we asked the Israelis, and they sort of said, no, it's a fine place to be a child. If you listen to the UN or anyone with any remote semblance of independence, what they will tell you is what's happening in Gaza now is hell, and it's hell because the Israelis are fighting a war or a genocidal campaign which seems to have no compunction about killing entire families, including thousands and thousands of children. The Greens are hoping to win 4 seats at this general election, which would be massive for the party, which has only ever held 1 parliamentary seat. It's only ever had 1 MP. The geography of those 4 target seats, though, shows the Greens might have a dilemma. Now, that's because 2 of the seats are in very left-wing parts of the country. That's where they're competing with Labour. So Brighton Pavilion currently has Caroline Lucas as its MP. Sian Berry is now standing to replace her as the Green. In Bristol Central, you've got Carla Denyer, who is the co-leader of the Green Party, standing against Fangam Debonair. So 2 of the sort of most left-wing parts of Britain, really, or sort of liberal left-wing parts of Britain where the Greens are competing. The other 2, so the other 2 of the 4 they might win, are in rural seats, and where instead of competing with Labour, the Greens are competing with the Conservatives. Now, of those rural seats, one is in North Herefordshire. Now, in 2019, the Tories won this seat with 63% of the vote, but polling commissioned by the Greens shows they could now be in with a chance of winning. So here, this is a voter intention poll done by WeThink. So sort of an independent pollster, but it was commissioned by the Green Party. Shows the Green Party on 39%, the Conservatives on 28%, Labour down on 15%, Reform on 13%. So that looks like, wow, the Greens could really come and take what's thought of as a bit of a Tory stronghold. Slightly less dramatic when you include don't knows, because the vast majority of people, it turns out, in this survey didn't know who they were going to vote for. So 44% of people said they didn't know. Then you can obviously see the Greens still ahead on people who've said they know, but on 21%, the Conservatives 16%. The other seat, the other Tory seat where the Greens could win is in Waveney Valley in Suffolk. So this is a new seat. So it doesn't have an incumbent MP, but it covers formerly Tory constituencies. In this seat, you've got the Greens on 37% and the Conservatives on 24%, Labour down on 17%. Again, less dramatic with the don't knows, because 34% of people have said they don't know in this constituency. But now you've got, that's fewer don't knows than before, and you've still got the Greens ahead on 23% with the Conservatives on 15%. Standing in Waveney Valley is the Greens co-leader Adrian Ramsey. So one of the co-leaders, Carla Denyer, she's standing in Bristol Central, and the other co-leader standing in Waveney Valley. So you've got one competing with the Labour Party, one competing with the Conservatives. Adrian Ramsey was asked by the BBC's Nick Robinson whether Conservative voters might be put off by the Greens' more left-wing commitments.
There are people who agree with what you say about the climate. They worry about the countryside. They see the vast amount of money. They hear your attitude to drugs and to migration. They see the candidates and they say, the Greens have become, have they not, the new party of the radical far left.
Nick, the people I speak to in East Anglia every day, many of whom have traditionally voted Conservative and feel utterly let down by this government, make very clear that they're looking for a change, for a positive alternative. They're thinking about what the future will be like for their children and grandchildren. And they know that having Green voices in Parliament to stand up for the environment, press for the restoration of public services, will push the new government to be bolder. And they're planning to vote for a positive change and for more Green MPs in that next Parliament.
Grace, I want your thoughts on this. I know you've been thinking a lot about the Greens at this election. In a way, it's an opportunity. If you can appeal, obviously, to Conservative voters and Labour voters, that's great. That means you can have more success. But does it also provide sort of a tension, or maybe a dilemma, or a breach that the party will struggle to bridge?
Yeah, look, this is part of the reason that the Green Party is set up in the way it is. It is quite decentralised, unlike most of the major parties that we have today, where power is highly centralised in a kind of coterie of the leader and officials, which means the local campaigners are able to run quite localised campaigns, similar to the Lib Dems in that sense, I suppose, in the sense that a lot depends on the local campaign, how that's run, what the specific issues are in that particular area. But it's also why they obviously have this, part of why they have this kind of dual leadership structure as well, which allows them to kind of present multiple faces to multiple different constituencies. Now, political parties do that all the time. You will have very different kinds of MPs selected in different parts of the country, catering to different constituencies. It's much more of an issue for the Greens and indeed lots of other smaller parties when they are, really trying to fight back against this weird majoritarian electoral system to just get any level of kind of localized success. The party's set up in this way for a reason. I think, the don't knows there are interesting, right? I think it speaks to a couple of different things. The first of which is that there are probably going to be quite a few people in that don't know category who just don't vote. Now, I've been, speaking to people running campaigns in lots of different places. And even when it's, the Labour Party, they're saying that they're going onto the doorstep and hearing a lot of people say, yeah, we don't like the Tories, but we don't actually know what Labour's going to do. And kind of being pressed quite a bit on the actual policies that they're going to be delivering, and on Starmer as a person as well, as you've just said, is not particularly well liked. So that could potentially depress the actual number of people who come out and vote, in which case you will start seeing kind of potentially a bit weirder dynamics such as those that we've seen in Waveney Valley. And that also, people aren't particularly inspired by any one of the major political parties. and in that sense may well be willing to lend their vote to a party that they see as a kind of single issue party that's able to give a kind of kicking to the establishment. So for those on the right, that's reform. But for a lot of people, including some former Tory voters, who have in the past kind of 5-10 years come to see climate as like the big issue for them, they are willing to kind of lend a vote to the Greens so that they can campaign on that issue. There are a lot of people. There was this march over the weekend, right, where there are lots of kind of people that you might not expect to see at marches, but who are really, really concerned about climate breakdown and about our governments, about successive governments, basically refusal to do anything on a scale that is even remotely radical enough to protect the planet and indeed protect the natural environment all across the country. So they could benefit from that kind of, single issue momentum as well. I hope that they do, because we need people in Parliament, whether those are independent candidates like Jeremy Corbyn and Faiz Shaheen, or Green MPs, who are going to be able to hold this massive Labour majority to account. We're going to need some sort of convincing vote share for the Greens, both in terms of seats and also in terms of a national vote share, to be able to say there are a lot of people who are very angry at Labour already, even before they've gone into power, over Gaza, over its refusal to commit to increases in spending on public services, over climate, over all these things. So we really need those voices in power. So again, if you're in any of those local areas and you have the time and effort, then definitely get down there and join the campaign.
Let's talk about one prominent former Tory who has said he might vote Green. So ex-Tory MP Rory Stewart has told The Guardian, "I guess my hand will float over Labour, but will probably come down on Lib Dems or the Greens." That sparked a lot of debate on Twitter. In contrast, one person who definitely won't be voting Green is Dale Vince. He is the green energy entrepreneur. He used to fund Just Stop Oil, but now has penned an opinion piece for Bristol independent newspaper B247, and where he says this: "Labour offers an opportunity to get a Green government for the very first time." In the article, Vince makes this argument for voting for Labour's Fangam Debonair in Bristol Central instead of the Greens' Carla Denyer. So he says this: "I have a lot of respect for the Green Party and have lots of friends in it all the way back to its founders. But the undeniable truth of our electoral system is that the Greens can't form a government on July the 4th and Labour can. And Labour has a Green manifesto. Some might argue that the Green Party manifesto is greener. I don't think there's much in it myself. The big difference is Labour's can be delivered. Only Labour can deliver a Green government." He says, "Carla Denyer has asked the question, do you want to give Labour a huge unassailable victory? My answer to that is emphatically yes, because Labour needs as big a majority as we can give them so they can make the really big changes we need. A big win means big political capital for a manifesto that is truly green." This is really strange. It's a really strange decision. I completely get. So this guy, successful businessman, Ecotricity, I think, so sort of like a green electricity company. He has made a transition from sort of supporting direct action groups to supporting a political party. Now that I completely, I don't know if I say I endorse it. I definitely understand it. It seems very, very coherent to me. But the idea of then saying, in this election where the Labour Party are 100% definitely going to form a government, I'm going to tell you to vote Labour against one of the few seats that the Green Party could win. Now, there is no way that Fangam Debonair winning at this election means there is a bigger mandate for this government or the next government to take radical action on green issues than if Carla Denyer wins that. A Labour majority with a few green seats is clearly more effective if you want to, have a go at tackling the climate crisis. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. In terms of what he's saying about Labour's manifesto, this is an argument made by Dale Vince in this piece. He says, "Labour's plan for a publicly owned green energy company, GB Energy, is a game changer. Its target for 100% green electricity by 2030 is truly ambitious. I live and breathe green energy issues, and I think this is ambitious, not impossible, but it will require big, bold decisions. For that, Labour need a big, bold majority." The Greens have also said they'll sort of get decarbonisation by then. They're going to invest loads of money in it. The Labour Party are sort of going to be relying on private businesses. Vince is a businessman. We've got no idea why he's making this decision. But what's really strange about this, as I say, I can really understand why Dale Vince would have said, "Look, I'm done with Just Stop Oil. They've made their point. I want to sort of one, start supporting a political party because I want them to win, but also I want to get in with them because I want to influence their policy. That to me makes loads of sense. But what seems strange to me is that Dale Vince isn't just campaigning for Labour. He's campaigning for Labour specifically against potential Green MPs. So he's also been campaigning in Brighton Pavilion. So the two seats, or sort of the two, as we've been saying, the two sort of left-wing progressive seats where the Greens could beat Labour, he's saying, no, we really need Labour to win here so that they have a majority which is 2 MPs bigger, as opposed to having sort of the Green Party representation in Parliament being quadrupled, which is possible. Grace, I obviously can't read Dale Vince's mind, but this does seem like strange behaviour to me.
I think it's pretty obvious what's happened here. And it's that Dale Vince has either had a conversation with someone in the Labour team or just is guessing that if he goes and campaigns for Labour in these 2 seats where they're under threat from the Greens, that he will, A, potentially, as someone who is, a self-described kind of proponent of Green policies, able to sway the vote, and B, will curry massive amount of favour with a future Labour government. And that is not nothing in a sector like energy, particularly green energy, which is so heavily dependent upon government policy. It is a very sensible business decision for him to basically do what he thinks the Labour Party, the future government of this country, needs him to do in exchange for access in the future and, potentially the capacity to kind of influence their policy agenda in his favour and in the interests of his business. I think that's very clearly what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Dale Vince would say that this is purely, based on his political beliefs. There's nothing to do with his businesses. I imagine that would be his response. But as I say, it does. I can totally understand sort of saying my priority in this election is to campaign for Labour. To say my priority in this election is to campaign for Labour in seats that the Tories can't win and the Greens can, to me, just seems a little bit suspect and strange. Let's wrap up there. Grace, Blakeley, it's been a pleasure being joined by you this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And we will wrap up. I'll let my voice get a rest. Come back tomorrow. You've been watching Novara Live. Good night.